Hi, my name is Mary Ann Moran, and I live in New Haven, Connecticut, but I'm originally from Springfield, Mass., where my Irish father was born with his 6 sisters and brothers, and I'm here at the Irish Road Show talking about our Irish ancestry. So what I've learned about my family is that my great-grandmother and great-grandfather came from Dingle, and my great-grandfather was a fisherman, and his son, Patrick Moran, who was my grandfather, left Ireland around 1880, and boarded, I believe, a boat that went to England and then came to the United States and came directly to Springfield, Mass. And my grandmother, whose last name was Ash, was 2 years older than him, and she also boarded a boat from Dingle and went across to England and came to the United States, but they came separately. And I'm not sure whether they knew each other, but they both came, and they married here in the United States and then proceeded to have a family. And the thing that was really interesting to me is I never understood why they ended up coming to Springfield. So last year I went to Ireland, and with the research that my partner Sally did, we went to Dublin, and I met with a professor from the university there, and he told me, he asked me first, where did I come from? And I said, Springfield, Mass. And he said, well, you're here because of the Carneys. And the Carneys were friends of my father's. And then he started naming other people, and they were all my father's friends. And then I realized that the Carneys were the first family that went from Dingle to Springfield, and then they were the ticket for other people to come. And so they were invited, I guess they invited my grandmother and my grandfather to come, and they arrived in Springfield, and my grandfather was able to get a job on the railroad, which was very common then. A lot of the Irish in Springfield worked on the railroad. And I know that they were very, very poor and struggled. And when my father was a year old, my grandfather was killed on the railroad. He was under the train working on it, and they didn't realize it, and they went over him. So now my grandmother was left with no job, no income, and with 6 kids, well, 5 kids at that point, because the first baby died a year after he was born. So I'm pretty sure it's the Catholic Church that she lived down the street from, which was Sacred Heart Church. The priest there, I think, helped her get a job in the Catholic schools there, and that was a way that she was able to support her family. But what I've since learned is that the area that I grew up in Springfield was an Irish area where the Irish settled, the state rep that I worked for was a Boland, who was my father's friend. And when you go to Dingle, I could see the Boland real estate business. I could see the Carney business. I could see the Ash pub, which I think may be related to my family. I'm going to go back in October and see if there's some connection there. So I always wondered, how did they survive the famine? How did my grandmother and grandfather get here, and how did they not die? And now I pretty much understood that though they were poor, and I'm sure they were starving, the fish that they were able to get is probably what allowed them to live and to have a dream of coming to the United States, because what they were left with there, you know, their mother and father went through the famine, and they were children, and so they probably realized they were going to have no life there, and they needed to leave. And they had the courage and the strength to do it, and they did. My father in particular, my memories of him is that he would always play this opera music that was Irish, and Irish, old Irish music that these Irish singers, and I can remember as a child sitting there and listening to it and how soothing it was to him and how much it meant to him, even though he and his siblings were born here and they were the first generation. So now I'm in the process of going back and trying to find more out about the family, like were there brothers and sisters to my great-grandfather and great-grandmother? Are there other relatives over there that I don't know about? Because out of the 6 kids that my grandmother and grandfather had, I'm the only grandchild, because I had an uncle Thomas that died when he was 30. My Aunt Mary could never have children. My Aunt Betty never got married. My Uncle Francis died when he was 15. So the only one left that had a child was my father. So I'm the last living relative of that family. So now I'm just curious and trying to flesh out the whole story of what their lives were like and how they survived, because I'm just amazed that they did. So this is a continuation of my tape, Mary Ann Moran, and my discovery of my grandparents coming from Dingle and actually going to Dingle this past year to see what it was like and to see where they lived and what their life was like. And knowing how my father talked about how poor they were, I had no idea what to expect. And when we rented a car and drove into Dingle, I had no idea it was going to be such a beautiful, gorgeous living place with the ocean and the bay and the mountains, and then the fields with the cows and the sheep. I thought it was the most beautiful place I've ever seen, and I've traveled around the world and I had just never seen anything like that, and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. They were so poor, but they lived in one of the most beautiful places in the world. And part of what we did was we decided to walk into Dingle just to kind of get a feel and to go down the Strand, because with the research we did, the Strand was the street that they lived on. And so we wanted to walk around to see what that was like. And in the process of walking and seeing all these little row houses that were exactly the way they were originally, but painted differently, and some of them had been joined together to be a pub or a restaurant, I started seeing the names of the people that were my father's friends. So we go by a Boland real estate business, and Boland was the state rep for our area, and I worked for him when I was in high school. And then we go by a Kearney business, and Kearney I learned from the geologist that we talked to, that was the Kearneys were the first family to come from Dingle and go to Springfield. And then we come upon Ash's Pub, and Ash was the maiden name of my grandmother. So I'm interested in going in there, and I try to find the owner there, but the young man that was at the bar told me that he would be there at some point, so we decided to sit down and have something to eat. And I'm looking up at this picture, and it's a picture of Gregory Peck with this group of older people that I assume were the people that owned the pub. So I said to the bartender, I said, so why have you got a picture of Gregory Peck? He said, because he's related to the Ashes. So then I'm sitting there thinking, I'm related to Gregory Peck through my grandmother possibly. So we went back there several times, and it was clear that that had been 3 separate units that they had put together. And I suspect that that might have been where the Ashes lived, and that they kept that, and then they made it into a bar. But on our next trip, I'm hoping we can go there and I can actually meet the owner, because I suspect from what the young man told me that he's probably around the age that I am, and so he would probably have information about the family. And then, as we're walking around, we go by Moran's, we would call it a gas station, but it was like a center where they had the tourist buses, and they had a little convenience store, and they had, I think, a dry cleaners, and then you went around the corner, and that's where they were repairing everybody's cars. So I decided to go into that area because I figured the owner would probably be in the area where they were fixing the cars. So we go in, and there are these two gentlemen there, and I walk in, and they clearly look at me, and they know that I'm not from there. And so they say to me, "So how can we help you?" I said, "Well, I'm a Moran, and I'm trying to figure out if the Morans that own this business are connected to me." And so the first thing they say to me is, "Where are you from?" I said, "Springfield, Mass." And they're like, "Oh my God, oh my God. We used to go to Springfield all the time. I've been to Springfield 4 times. We know the Carneys," and they start naming everybody. And I said, "Well, who is the owner here?" And they said, "Well, actually, his son is here. He's not here, but let me get his son." So they get his son, and his son comes out, and I explain who I am, and he said, "Well, you know, the one you should talk to is my dad, but I can call him and see if there's some way the two of you could get together." So he calls him, and he's busy that day, but he wants me to come back to the garage at 4 o'clock the next day, and he will sit with us and talk, and we'll see if we're related. So we go back, and there's this older man, and the minute I looked at him, he reminded me of my father. There were facial features on him that reminded me of my father. But in the conversation in which he told how he had never gone to Springfield, but a lot of the Morans in his family did, that he decided he wanted to stay in Dingle and create this business, which he did. He said, "I don't think you're related to me, though. I think you're related to another Moran," because he started naming his relatives that were older than him, and it was none of the names of the people that we had researched. So, you know, I don't think I'm directly connected to him, but he certainly, I said to him, "So I understand that my grandparents were fishermen." And he said, "Well, I'm going to tell you right now, if they were, you go across the street, on that street over there, and you walk down the street, and you're going to see 4 lots with metal gates in front. That's where the fishermen lived, and I would bet that's where your grandfather and grandmother lived. And the back of the house, they would go in the front door, and they'd go out the back of the house, and the boat would be there, and they would go out and they would fish right into the bay." So, you know, it was pretty amazing to go to this place, and, you know, part of it had been developed, but this one section they left the way it was with these gates, and everybody in the community, I guess, knew that that's where the fishermen lived. And then when you look beyond it, that's where they had the docks for the current fisher boats that go out and fish. So that was pretty amazing to get that bit of information and to talk with him, because he knew everything about Dingle, and you could tell he was like one of the patriarchs of Dingle. And then we were able to drive to Blasket Memorial. It was like a museum, because I wanted to go there because in Dublin they had said that it's very possible our family could be connected to that. And so in going to the museum, you could see the island, and you could see the houses on the island, and you could see the beach where they brought the boats up to do the fishing. And then we went inside the museum and just saw all this history of the writers that were on Blasket Island that would go there and write, and the families, and the boats they made out of, the canoes they made out of the wood, and the priests that would come over on Sunday. And it was just fascinating to see that this island of, I think at their height was about 130 people, lived on this island, and they totally were self-sufficient and made their own clothes and produced their own food and fished, and their kids went to school there. And then occasionally they would come over if they couldn't, the priest couldn't come to Mass on Sunday, they would come if it wasn't too rough, get in the boat and go to Mass on the mainland. But it was amazing to see how out in the open it was, and how they survived there and they lived there. And it was a you know, Peg Sayers. I got a couple of her books, and I read some of the stories she would tell people about Blasket Island, and just the kind of memory they had to tell these stories was just mind-boggling. Everything was word of mouth that they would hand down from one generation to the next. So in going back, I really want to find out if any of the relatives did live on Blasket Island, and then I would want to go there. I'd want to take a boat and go there and be on it and see what it was like, because it was just amazing to see this island and then the other islands that go off from it, and imagine that people live there and survive there.